early hours of August 24, 2011, at the Ngokbit Gold Shop on Sand Street, Song Commune, Luc Nam District, Boksoang Province, a break-in robbery escalated into a tragedy that left several members of the shop owner's family seriously harmed. Some did not survive, while one young child survived but was critically injured, shocking the entire area because of the case's exceptional severity and because all the victims were members of a well-known local trading family. According to reports at the time, the perpetrator was believed to have chosen the late night, early morning hours, taking advantage of the quiet neighborhood and the layout of a house that also served as a storefront to find a way inside, and then cut off or disabled key security elements such as electricity, cameras, or an alarm, a detail that later became a major point of debate. If the surveillance system was interfered with, how was it done, for how long, and why the footage did not clarify the entire sequence of events. Before searching for valuables on the display level and in storage areas. When someone in the house discovered what was happening, resistance and a struggle reportedly unfolded in a confined space, leading to an especially heartbreaking outcome. And by later that morning, the scene was discovered, authorities sealed off the area, conducted examinations, and began tracking leads, while nationwide public attention immediately focused on two big questions. Why did a robbery turn into such an extreme crime? And was it carried out by only one person, or were others involved? In the first days, information spread rapidly and fueled many rumors, but investigators at the time emphasized sticking to physical evidence, such as traces left at the scene, routes of entry and exit, where items were dropped or hidden, and especially DNA samples from bloodstains collected, because there was a period when people talked about an unknown blood sample and the possibility of an accomplice. Later, the police announced that this genetic profile matched the identified suspect, and they said they had no reliable leads suggesting a second perpetrator at the stage when information was widely released. However, because the case was so severe and involved many technical details, cameras, power supply, escape routes, how the house was approached, and how valuables were concealed, a parallel set of unusual questions continued to form in society alongside the official investigation. Some wondered how a suspect who had only observed the exterior could know how many people were inside. Some claimed the surviving child had once spoken of seeing more than one person in the home. Some lawyers pointed to reports of a car parked near the scene at a sensitive time and called for clarification. There were also disputes about where the suspect had stayed before the incident. A guest house in Doing Gold Township was mentioned in public debate, but those details were not publicly disclosed in the thorough way the victim's family hoped for. And there were also concerns about how the gold evidence was counted, recovered, and sealed. Questions like, was it counted by individual pieces or weighed by total mass? And was there any discrepancy before and after? Issues that might sound small but can heavily affect public trust when placed next to the seriousness of the case. On an even deeper level, a debate over deterrence versus the rule of law began to emerge as soon as people learned that the suspect was under 18 at the time. meaning that even if the charges were extremely serious, the sentencing framework for juveniles under the law at that time was legally capped, and this later became the focal point of public anger, grief, and broader social argument. But in this part 1, the most important thing remains the picture of the first hours after the incident. A small community abruptly plunged into shock, a crime scene filled with unanswered questions, investigators racing against time to follow traces and locate a suspect, and the victim's family and local residents caught between loss, confusion, and the feeling that something still hasn't been fully explained. And from that moment, the manhunt began moving into its decisive phase. When the terrible news spread on the morning of August 24, 2011, the atmosphere in Lucknow shifted into a truly emergency state. Son Street was sealed off, and investigators combed through even the smallest traces, possible points of entry, escape routes, shoe prints, fingerprints, locations that had been disturbed inside the shop and the family's living area, while also working backward through relationships, unusual buying and selling signals, and anyone who had appeared around the gold shop in the days before. While public emotions surged because the loss was so devastating, the most decisive investigative direction lay in things that felt cold and highly technical, especially a blood trace at the scene that was not immediately attributed to the victims, because identifying the owner of that sample could narrow down a suspect far faster than chasing rumors. Only a few days later, authorities stated that the unknown blood had been DNA tested and matched Lei von Leeuwen, and they also said they had no reliable leads pointing to a second perpetrator beyond him. This helped investigators focus, but it also ignited a polarized public debate. One side saw biological evidence as the key, while the other kept asking, if it was only one person, how could he handle so many situations in a single night, especially since many details circulated through multiple sources and were not fully consistent with one another. The manhunt intensified. According to press accounts, after 6 days in hiding, the suspect was surrounded and arrested near a border trail area close to the Vietnam-China border, with border guard forces directly involved. The date frequently cited is August 31, 2011. That moment of capture led many to believe the case had entered a clarified chapter, but in reality it opened a new chapter filled with further questions. Leeuwen reportedly said his motive stemmed from needing a large sum of money to deal with debts, and that he targeted the gold shop because he believed it was one of the wealthier locations in the area. The plan was described as opportunistic, yet it also appeared to involve preparations serious enough to alarm the public, choosing the timing, calculating an escape route, and finding a place to hide valuables after taking them. Police later announced the recovery of a quantity of gold jewelry said to be related evidence, including reports that multiple items had been buried behind the suspect's home. Public shock deepened because it felt as if the entire tragedy might have begun with an intention to steal and get out, yet ended in irreversible consequences. However, it was precisely at this stage, a suspect, a confession, and recovered property, that the points considered abnormal became more visible and fueled continued questions about accomplices, or at least someone who may have helped before or after the crime. First, the question of how well the suspect seemed to know the shop owner's routines. For example, how he could be confident about how many people were inside, and whether anyone might have provided information. Second, the issue of where he stayed the night before the incident. Some articles mentioned a guest house in Doi No Township, but public discussions argued over how thoroughly the address, route, timeline, and related individuals were verified. Third, injuries described in records or articles that the suspect did not fully acknowledge the origin of, raising the suspicion that there may be situations not fully explained. And fourth, scattered side information, vehicles seen near the scene, unusual passers-by, or second-hand stories from neighbors, details that might be weak on their own, but in a nationwide shock case can combine into a lingering sense that something still does not add up. The investigatory authorities and later the court, according to what mainstream reporting stated, continued to conclude that the core criminal conduct belonged to Lei Von Luen, and that debates about accomplices largely lacked sufficient evidence to change the nature of the case. But the reason Part 2 needs to be told carefully is not to feed rumors. It is to show a reality. In high-profile cases, the gap between what the public feels is reasonable and what the legal process accepts as evidence meeting procedural standards can be very large, and that gap is exactly what allows doubts to persist for many years. In the next part, I will tell the prosecution and trial timeline, why the maximum sentence was only 18 years in prison because the suspect was under 18 at the time of the crime, and the legal and social consequences that made this one of the most frequently revisited cases for more than a decade. After the suspect was arrested and the investigation was completed, the case moved into the prosecution and trial phase, also the phase that triggered the fiercest public debate because the legal outcome did not satisfy the emotions of many people. The first instance trial was reported to have taken place at the Bok-Song Provincial People's Court in January 2012. The trial panel sentenced Lei Van Luen to 18 years in prison for murder, 18 years for robbery, and an additional 9 months for another charge related to unlawful appropriation of property. However, when the sentences were combined, the overall term remained 18 years because the defendant committed the crime while under 18, and Vietnamese law in this circumstance caps the maximum sentence for juvenile offenders and does not allow life imprisonment or the death penalty. This legal pressure point sparked a wave of outrage because many people looked at the consequences and felt the punishment was far too light. Meanwhile, lawmakers and judicial authorities emphasized that the court was required to follow the legal principles for handling juvenile offenders under the criminal code. Even for an exceptionally serious act, the sentence cannot exceed the statutory ceiling. Media reporting at the time also noted that the defendant was less than 1 month away from turning 18 when the crime occurred, meaning the sentencing framework was effectively locked by age. After the first instance verdict, the victim's family and their lawyer continued to appeal and submit petitions requesting that additional issues be clarified. The most prominent point remained the suspicion of accomplices and details they considered unresolved, such as the movement timeline before and after the crime, the alleged interference with security features inside the house, certain statements that changed over time, and the central question of whether one person could realistically manage all the situations that occurred during the night. The appellate trial took place in late March 2012 in Bokseong. The appellate court upheld the 18-year sentence and announced a conclusion indicating no signs of accomplices in the case, while also considering the roles of other related individuals under offenses such as harboring or concealing a crime, or failure to report a crime. These points also contributed to public understanding that the case did not involve only one person appearing before the court, even though the primary responsibility for the criminal acts was still attributed to Lin under the court's conclusion. From that point on, the story evolved into a broader social debate. One side questioned justice for the victims and pushed for harsher punishment. The other viewed it as a clear example of the rule of law principle. The court cannot sentence based on outrage, but must sentence according to the law, even when that creates a sense of contradiction for much of the public. What kept the case being revisited for many years was not only the sentence itself, but also a lingering sense among some observers that something still wasn't fully explained. They focused on questions such as why suspicions of accomplices were not accepted. The court said there was insufficient evidence. Why some side details mentioned in the press or in retellings did not become decisive evidence, and why the procedural standard of certainty is so high that many things that sound plausible still cannot withstand scrutiny in court. If parts 2, 3 were about investigation and trial, then part 4 is the section many people care about the most, the points regarded as suspicious and unusual, and how they were presented in court, because these very fragments are what kept the case under debate for many years. First is the suspicion of whether there was an accomplice. During courtroom arguments, The victim's family's lawyers stated that the surviving child had once said they saw two people inside the house, and questioned why this detail was not clarified to a proportionate extent, while the defendant's statements were accepted as the main narrative framework of the case. Second is the unknown car. The lawyer said that someone had seen a car parked in front of the shop at a sensitive time before the incident, and raised questions such as, whose car was it, why was it there, and was it connected? Yet from the victim's family's perspective, the effort to clarify this point did not produce an answer they found sufficiently convincing. Third is the extent to which the suspect seemed to know the household's routines. The judgment or assessment, as quoted by the press, indicated that the defendant claimed he only observed the exterior and believed he could climb in to break in, yet he also gave statements suggesting he knew how many people were in the house. This led the lawyer to ask, if he only watched from outside, how could he know for sure how many people were inside, and was there any supporting source of information? Fourth is the guest house in Doing O. At the appellate hearing, the lawyer again raised a point that the defendant had said he rented a room at a guest house in the Doing O area before the crime, and requested verification of who he stayed with and whether anyone accompanied him, because if someone went with him, the accomplice theory would have a more concrete direction to test. Fifth is the mechanism behind certain injury traces. The lawyer argued that some traces differed from the weapon description the defendant admitted, and debated whether there might have been another situation or another object involved. However, this category is highly technical, and the court ultimately concluded that the case file, forensic examination, and scene reenactment were consistent with the defendant's statements, and that there was not enough basis to open a separate direction involving a second person. And the point that triggered the largest public argument fell into the category of technical but decisive, the unknown blood or DNA at the scene. Investigators stated that besides the victim samples, there was only one unknown blood sample, and that it matched Leigh Von Lin. Therefore, they treated it as a key element reinforcing the primary suspect direction. When you place all these points together, you can see why two frames of reference existed side by side. One is the procedural evidentiary standard. The court said there was no basis to determine an accomplice. The statements matched the reenactment, and traces matched forensic conclusions, so the verdict stood. The other is the sense of incompleteness felt by the victim's family and part of the public, because there was mention of two people, a suspicious car, a guest house detail, and other things that sounded unresolved. This gap is exactly what made the case a hot point in social debate. Some emphasized that conclusions based on evidence must be respected, while others remained troubled that if certain details were not fully clarified, justice did not truly feel closed. When the appellate judgment on March 30, 2012 upheld the 18-year prison term for Le Van Luent and concluded, based on the court's assessment, that there were no signs of accomplices, the case was, in procedural terms, essentially closed at the ordinary trial level. Yet socially, it set off a long-lasting aftershock because it was one of the rare cases in which the public was forced to confront three difficult realities at the same time: the victim's family's grief, widespread anger over the sentence, and a feeling that some questions had not been answered in a way that satisfied the majority. Legally, the core controversy centered on age. Because the defendant committed the offenses while under 18, even though the court imposed 18 years for murder, 18 years for robbery, and an additional sentence for another property-related offense, the combined sentence was still capped at 18 years under the juvenile sentencing principle in Vietnamese law, and the serving period was calculated from the time of arrest or detention as reported in the press. That is why a cascade of questions followed. Is it right or wrong for the law to protect a minor's chance of rehabilitation when the consequences are so severe? Should there be a special mechanism for exceptionally serious crimes? And if the law is changed, would that conflict with the humanitarian and educational foundations of juvenile justice? In court, the civil liability portion also highlighted that the consequences were not only about imprisonment. The defendant and his family were ordered to pay substantial compensation to the victim's family and to provide support for the surviving child until adulthood. After the appellate stage, the civil compensation was also adjusted upward, and related individuals, such as relatives, were addressed under offenses like concealing a crime or failing to report it, according to the court statements as covered by the media. Still, no amount of compensation, no matter how large, can truly trade back what was lost. For many people following the case, the deeper focus became what led to the tragedy and how can it be prevented from happening again. From there, the discussion gradually shifted towards social lessons, practical safety lessons for the common home plus shop model, reinforced doors, cameras, alarms, where valuables are stored, escape paths, coordination with neighbors, community vigilance, recognizing signs of surveillance, unfamiliar faces nearby, consistent habits of locking up, and above all, an awareness of how fragile the belief can be that familiar places are automatically safe. At the same time, The case became a reference point in broader debates about juvenile justice in Vietnam. Years later, rules related to handling offenders under 18 continued to be refined toward emphasizing education and reintegration. Notably, the government has also summarized that under the Law on Juvenile Justice 2024, effective January 1, 2026, the maximum prison term for ages 16 to under 18 is generally reduced from 18 to 15 years, except for 5 specific categories of particularly serious crimes, including murder, where the maximum remains as under existing law. This shows lawmakers and society are still searching for a balance between community protection, victims' rights, and humanitarian principles for minors. As for the disputed, suspicious points that fueled public controversy, such as whether there was a second person, plus side details about vehicles, routes, or lodging, the publicly stated conclusions of the court and procedural authorities remained insufficient evidence to establish an accomplice. So legally, the story ended at the evidentiary standard. Emotionally, however, families in severe cases often carry a lasting sense of not having received a fully satisfying explanation, and that is one reason the public kept revisiting the case like a wound that did not feel fully healed. The key when retelling the story today is to maintain respect for the victims and avoid turning tragedy into spectacle. Rather than focusing on shocking details, the narrative should end with alertness and clear-headed reflection that one wrong choice can destroy many lives, that legal justice doesn't always match collective emotion, and that what each of us can do is learn to protect our families better, support our communities more effectively, and talk about such cases as lessons for prevention, not as fuel for hatred or real-world manhunts. And so the Le Van Luent case entered social memory as a painful but cautionary milestone. Safety doesn't happen by itself. The law must be understood correctly, and empathy for victims must go hand in hand with responsibility, building preventative barriers so similar tragedies have fewer chances to repeat.